Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Atlas Project. This is episode 18. Tonight, we're going to talk about part 2, chapter 8, By Our Love. We're glad to be back in our usual setup. We've got everything working correctly tonight, I think. Greg's back in New York. I'm in New Orleans as usual. I thought that I would start out tonight by making an announcement that I think should be of general interest. And I want to actually keep making this announcement for the next few weeks because especially if you are just passing by and noticing this broadcast maybe for the first time tonight, you should know that we're doing an online reading group about Atlas Shrugged, Ayn Rand's magnum opus novel. And you should remember that there is an essay contest that the Ayn Rand Institute sponsors where you can win up to $10,000 for a first prize essay. There are smaller amounts for other places in the contest. If you are a 12th grader in high school, you can actually win $2,000 just for being the top high school student, regardless of how else you place. One of the reasons that we conceived of this reading group was so that people could immerse themselves in the novel in order to prepare for this essay contest in case they wanted to enter. The deadline for the contest is in the middle of May 15th. So there's still plenty of time to work on your essay and plenty of time to go back and review episodes of the Atlas Project on previous chapters. We're more than halfway done with it, but all the recordings are online if you want to go back and review things that we've already talked about. The way to do that is to join the Atlas Project Facebook group, which is facebook.com/groups/Atlas Project, or go to Atlas Project Live, which contains links to all the past recordings. I put links to all of these websites in the comments section of the current post on the Atlas Shrugged page if you're interested. And also, if you're interested in finding out what the questions for the essay contest are, please go to aynrand.org/contests. There's a link to that in the comments section there as well. And I really do wish the best of luck to those of you who are thinking about entering the contest. I think it can be a really exciting thing to participate in. Some of us got interested in Ayn Rand in the first place because we read a book for an essay contest. That was the case for me with The Fountainhead, and we're looking forward to reading your essays. So that was the main announcement that I wanted to make, Greg. If you are out there, you can, I think, take it away on your end. And be sure to turn your mic on when you do it.
Thank you, Ben. Thanks for reminding me. Chris online is saying, oh man, you guys are going at the same time as Yaron is debating. Tough choice, and that's true. Yaron Brook is in a debate about selfishness across town, actually. He's in New York tonight, and I think that thinned out our ranks of people who are here in person over what they usually are. But we have a good group, and we're happy to continue. We're as Carrie Ann pointed out, and Robert. Well, I don't think you can watch them both at the same time, but since they're all archived online, you could watch one after the other.
Lyndon Johnson managed to watch 3 networks at the same time. I don't know why we all couldn't.
Well, none of us are Lyndon Johnson, Ben. As Carrie Ann pointed out, we're coming to you on the night of January 16th, which for Ayn Rand fans might know there's a novel, or rather a play of that name by her. And on this night of January the 16th, we're discussing Chapter 8 of Part 2, which takes place on the day of May 28th in the second year of the novel. And what's going on? Well, it opens up on Daphne in Woodstock. She's now been in Woodstock for about a month, and she's looking out on the forest, kind of contemplating the past month, trying to figure out what to do with her life in a way that she's been doing this whole month, trying to figure this out and tracking the kind of progress she made, what questions are still open in her mind, when she hears a motor approaching, and she expects it to be Hank Reardon coming finally. He said he would come to her at some point, and she's been impatient for him. But it wasn't Hank Reardon, it's Francisco d'Anconia. And we have a really interesting discussion between them, reminiscent of some of the previous discussions that Francisco's had with Reardon and with Daphne also, but new revelations made in this discussion, and I think it's advancing the plot quite a bit. But the discussion is broken by the news of the train disaster in Colorado. She's had the radio on quietly playing a symphony in the background. That's alluded to at several points. And then all of a sudden it breaks through with news of this disaster. And actually that reminds me, I got a little ahead of myself and of us last week when I was talking about the problem with the train and the train being sent into the tunnel last week. I mentioned that it causes an explosion. But of course, we don't learn about that explosion until this chapter. We just learn that all the passengers die, which they die of asphyxiation even before the military freight with its munitions comes through, creates a great explosion that seals off the tunnel. And Daphne hears this and leaps into action. Francisco tries to stop her, but she runs to her car. We'll talk a little more about that later. And then the novel cuts to Jim sitting in his office. And we see how he's taking the news of this disaster, how he's dealing with it. Among other things, he runs out to confront Eddie Willers to try to berate him again and try to get him to tell him where Daphne is. And Eddie's standing firm, he'll never tell. She'll never come back. And then who walks in but Daphne? And we get to see what she's like on her return. We see her dealing with Eddie, her attempts to solve the catastrophe, or her first, moves towards it, and her phone call to Hank Reardon. And that's our chapter. So we're going to go through the scenes as we've been doing, basically in order. We might jump around as we see things to compare them. And so we'll start with this first scene. It begins and ends, it begins with Daphne looking out at Woodstock, but we get in her reflections before Francisco comes, we get a kind of recounting of her months there and of the issues she's been dealing with over the course of the month. And she set herself 3 assignments as orders, right, that she gave herself when she comes to Woodstock, 3 things that she's going to do. We asked people online to comment on what is she trying to accomplish there and to what extent is she successful. And several people, Alex, who's with us, and JG, pointed out that there are 3 explicit assignments she gave herself. So those are clearly a very big part of what she's trying to accomplish. I think the bulk of it, and they are, I'll just quote, 3 assignments given as orders to herself: rest, learn to live without the railroad, and get the pain out of the way. And then we had a fair amount of commentary online about how she's doing this and what challenges she faces. Ben, do you want to summarize some of that for us, or start us off with some points from that discussion?
Well, the main one I think that you're talking about is what both Amber and David noted, is that as she's giving herself these assignments, I mean, what it means for her to learn to live without the railroad is to find what else there is to live with, in effect. She's looking for some kind of purpose to her life. And we're going to, I think, talk in a little more detail later about the significance of the concept of purpose in this chapter. But the point is, she's having a hard time doing it. I mean, she makes a whole bunch of different tasks for herself, kind of low level, kind of concrete, practical tasks, clearing paths and clearing brush and building a trail. And the trouble that she gets is every time she finishes it, she wonders where it's all going, what it's going to connect up to. And she doesn't know what the terminal for this right of way is going to be.
Yeah, I mean, so some of the building of the path, it's hard to know whether that's, one of the assignments is resting, and that's the one she found easiest. And part of her way of resting is engaging in this purposeful activity of building the path, or maybe it's a kind of therapy for herself. She says she doesn't know why she started doing it. She didn't even start it deliberately. She just found herself doing it. So that's the relaxing and the learning to live without the railroad. A lot of the learning to live without the railroad is connected to her thoughts on purpose and her view of trying to find a new purpose, as David and Amber point out. There's also the other element of what she's doing, which is, how did she put it in her assignment, get the pain out of the way. Does anybody have thoughts on that, whether here in New York or on the chat?
Well, I'll say something about it, Greg, unless somebody interrupts me. But I mean, part of what makes it difficult for her to get the pain out of the way is that she can't stop thinking about her railroad. She can't stop thinking about what used to be the purpose in her own life. And every time she engages in some task, she always relates it. She ends up relating it automatically in one way or another back to her old purpose in life. And that's where she keeps telling herself, stop it, stop it. I think this is very psychologically realistic. I can identify it even. Yeah, I can identify with it to some extent, having just changed careers myself, and having kind of viewed life through the lens of a certain career goal, and now transitioning to a completely different kind of, well, not completely, but very different kind of career where, the things that I'm used to, I see a paper that I could write for a philosophy journal or something like that, and I'm not a philosophy professor anymore. So what's the point? It's not going to do me any good anymore, but I still keep thinking about it. And yeah, it's painful because it was a big part of your life.
Any kind of change has this kind of an issue. There's also, if somebody dies, and you think something you want to tell them, there's a grieving process. I'm interested in the issue of, there's a special complication with her issue of setting a new purpose, which I think we're going to need to spend some time on. But even apart from that, there's the question of how she's dealing with the pain of the loss of the railroad, which is worth thinking about. I'm just noticing, Ben, Ben and I have a program whereby we view the comments that are coming up live on Facebook. Is that program working for you today, Ben? It's not working for me.
So far, yes. I can double check.
The railroad is still there. Grieve. Okay, I am getting comments. What's happening? The comments seem to be working, but the part of it that tells us how many people are viewing it is not accurate, or at least it says only one person is viewing it, but my software says 70 people are viewing it. But so
the comments are working.
Okay, but we are getting the comments live. Okay, good. All right, great. So, back into the moment. One thing that's worth thinking about is Daphne's way of dealing with the pain healthy? And does the author intend it to be, right? Her view is she's come here to get the pain over with, to get it out of the way. Those are the words she tells herself. And she sees it like, she's like some person who could be stricken with something at any moment, or rather like she's chained to some stricken, ailing person who's this person in pain, and she has a certain kind of contempt for that person. She wants to get the pain out of the way, get it over with. How should we think about that? Any thoughts on that issue? On her perspective on her own pain? Alex? Yeah.
She's trying to deal with the pain by means of avoiding it and evading all of these issues that she's been grappling with. Because her purpose is productivity, and she's seeing the railroad as the end result of all of her productive work that she's doing when she's building the path, when she's thinking about the waterfall. She can't evade thinking about the railroad. It's a natural consequence, and she's having trouble coming to terms with that.
So, okay, yeah. Carrie Ann, you want to join in on this?
Yeah, and also she seems to want to force it. You can't make yourself get through it, right? It's a natural process, but it only follows on the heels of genuinely reconciling yourself to letting go of something she hasn't. I think what she says is very telling. On 571 of the Mass Market edition, she knew that her desperate longing for the railroad would vanish were she to convince herself that it was impossible or improper, but she hasn't. She refuses to let go because she's torn. You can't deal with the pain properly. You can't force yourself through it before you've let go, and she hasn't. She still has some beliefs. She's connected to the railroad, and that's why she can't move on and let herself deal with it in a more natural fashion.
Yeah, so she can't grieve it until she's accepted that it's really gone, in a way. And yet she can't bring herself to accept that it's really gone, or that it has to be gone. There's something about the situation that she can't accept, and yet she's trying to move on despite that. And so you can call what she's doing evading it, or it's not. I mean, we'll have to talk more about the details of what's going on with her thinking about purpose. And you made some very good points, Alex, in the online thread about that I want to look at when we talk about that. But there is, she might be evading something there. She might be pushing something out of her mind. She might be doing something like what Reardon does when he seems to not be facing some of his emotions that he's afraid of. In any case, there's something. If you have, though, an unresolved issue that you feel a certain way about and you don't know how to resolve it, and yet that pain is constantly there and paralyzing to you, and you can't, I mean, it does seem it's a kind of natural enough thing to do to say, well, I got to get through this. How do I get through it? People coping with an emergency situation often do this. Ben, do you have any thoughts on this? Or is there anything coming up on the online?
There are a few things. I'm not sure what to say about them. I don't have more, except that, I mean, there is a point in the scene, pages 612 to 613 of the standard edition, where, I mean, for at least a short moment, she does seem to forget her pain. It's while she's listening to a symphony and enjoying a moment, looking at the rays of the sun and smoking a cigarette in characteristic fashion. But and she says, this is how I would really like to be able to hold things if I'm able to forget. Well, she says, let no memory of pain blunt her capacity to feel as she does right now. The question is how long she's going to be able to maintain that given everything else that she's dealing with.
Robert?
So if we backtrack to Daphne considering this possibility, when Francisco asked her this 12 years ago, she likened it to committing suicide. When she was ready to leave and the board voted her in, San Sebastian Mines, it was like getting her legs amputated. So she's had these extreme views of what would happen if she was not part of the railroad. And now she's facing that to a large extent. But I agree with Carrie that it doesn't sound like she's completely sold that this is it.
Yeah, and we could see from her conversation with Francisco that she's torn, right,
Yeah.
about it. And also from the passages that were already quoted about, you quoted before, she knew the feeling would go away if she could convince herself that it was right, that it was wrong, that the feeling was wrong and that it was right to give up the railroad. Harry online is saying that her way of dealing with the pain is consistent with her practice throughout. Somehow it is unimportant as an ethical issue for her. This is in contrast to examining what causes it. Harry, I'm not sure if you're saying that her view of it as unimportant is in contrast with it. Because she views it as unimportant, she won't bother examining what causes it, or what point you're making about the contrast.
I thought he meant that the pain was unimportant.
I mean, I think Daphne's view is that the pain is unimportant. It's not kind of what matters about the world. But he says it's in contrast to examining what causes it. And so I'm thinking maybe Harry's interpreting it as this view of hers that it's unimportant is what leads her not to examine its roots. Although there are times, at least, when she is examining its roots, right? There are times when she could view it in this more clinical manner. And when she does view it in this more clinical manner, she, is trying to figure out. She knows it would go away if she could convince herself that it was wrong to want to go back to the railroad, but she can't. She can't understand it, and I think she's really at an impasse here. Before we talk more about the issue of purpose with her, and that will go again to the issue of her. A lot of her problem here has to do with trying to figure out what her purpose is. One other aspect discussed early on in her time at Woodstock that I'd like to get some thoughts on, and that is her dealing with the locals in Woodstock. Any thoughts from the locals here in New York about those encounters? Yeah, Will.
Well, what I thought of was, what does this remind us of in an earlier episode?
Mm-hmm.
The people at the Starnesville.
Yeah.
Why don't you do something about such and such? Why?
It's always been that way.
So, and so this seems to be underlining that's what is the end of the path of destruction, which seems to be happening to more and more of the country and the world.
Yeah, that sounds right. So we're seeing Starnesville-like people, another place that's maybe on its way to becoming like Starnesville. Yeah, Alex.
There's an interesting comment from Daphne's thoughts where she thinks she could renounce the railroad, she thought. She could find contentment here in this forest, but she would build a path, then reach the road below, then rebuild the road, and then she would reach the storekeeper of Woodstock, and that would be the end. And the empty white face staring at the universe in stagnant apathy would be the limit placed on her effort.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that scene up. I think that reflection is really important. And actually, in one of the essays I wrote about Atlas, I talk a bit about that passage. So this storekeeper, right, is the best example we're seeing of the mindset that Will, you were just talking about. Daphne says, these vegetables, they're rotting out here. Why don't you move them? They've always been there. She's got, so she's in pain and has trouble moving, but she's indifferent to it. She's not trying to fix her pain. She's a little bit like Cheryl at one point, I think this scene was already, describes her family as stinking poor and not caring about it. They don't want to improve. They have problems and they're just, that's how it is. And this is how the people in Starnesville were. All right, so there are some people like this and they're lame and it's annoying. But it now takes on a new aspect for Daphne, not just, when she saw people like this in Starnesville, she didn't like them. She was horrified by their fate. She thought there was something bad about it. But now there's this new element, which, and this is going to really connect to the issue of purpose, any purpose that she chooses for herself is going to put her in contact with these kinds of people. And what they particularly are is, what's the connection between these types of people and the broader problems that have made her leave the railroad? Ben, actually, you have some issues I know you wanted to bring up in this connection.
Yeah, well, the reason that she left was because of Directive 10-289. And when we discussed this a couple of weeks ago, one of the things that we discussed was how it was really bringing out the kind of distilled essence of the looter mentality, which was this gradual narrowing and further narrowing of the range of awareness to the immediate moment. And insofar as what the directive wanted to do, it was basically to freeze everything in place. We've got to keep those bastards from running away. We got to make them stay still. And it's exactly the kind of attitude that things should always be the same. It's always been this way, and we want to keep it this way, damn it. These people are always trying to change things and build paths to new horizons. And so it's not like Dagny's, she left her job because of this, and she's encountering it wherever she goes. And you have to wonder what kind of purpose would be available to her in this world. Even if she were to go back to the railroad, she'd just be building lines to more people like this storekeeper.
Francisco describes the directive as a moratorium on brains, right? And the storekeeper is mindless in a sense. She doesn't care to improve her life. She takes no thought for the morrow or even for the rest of today. And she's not interested in how to make her life better, even easy things, right? And anything Dagny does is going to come up against people like this and against laws that are geared to this kind of mentality. So how could she project a purpose? Even if the purpose was to be in this forest. Okay, well, what would she do in this forest? And if you think about all the concrete purposes she comes up with, I could help these people reclaim the apple orchards, and then we'll sell the apples and we'll build to the nearest branch of the railroad. And it's taking her back to the railroad concretely, but even if she could get away with, all right, we'll ship them by trucks, it's still going to have the same problem of getting back to this world where Directive 10-289 is law, but also to this world where the people in there are not people who value thoughtful, enterprising, purposeful, long-range thinking. They have a law that's designed to thwart that.
And Greg, if you remember, there was a point
Ben, yeah,
where Francisco was speaking with Daphne, and he asked her, "You wouldn't run these trains if they were empty, would you?" And I mean, it's getting to the point where it's starting to look like that's the way it is. What she said she would do in that case was, throw herself in front of the train. Though she then said that was self-pity. So
is the if they were empty line in the conversation from the earlier chapter, or is that in chapter 9?
I think it's an earlier chapter. But yeah, you might be right that I'm jumping ahead because I
think it's in the next chapter, but the way we prepare for this has us reading the chapter for the next week and then this one, so it's easy for us to mix them up. But I think that's the chapter 9 conversation, but nonetheless, it's a point where she's viewing these people less. There's fewer and fewer people to run the train for, or at least people of the kind she respects. Good. So let's talk a little bit. Oh, Robert, you'd wanted to say something.
Well, there's one other purpose that she's had for half the book so far, which is finding the inventor of the motor, and that's completely absent from what she's thinking about right now. So she's even kind of put that goal aside.
Well, for some time now, she's stopped trying to find him, right? She traced him to Hugh Axton. Hugh Axton said, look, I'm the end of your trail. And we haven't really seen anything she's done since then to actively try to find the motor maker. But she has been, she's hired Quentin Daniels to at least try to reconstruct the motor. And we see that she wants desperately to find the motor maker, but it hasn't been something she's been doing anything about, other than this trying to have Daniels rebuild the motor. And it is part of her thinking at Woodstock. Indeed, it's what she's thinking on this morning as Francisco arrives. Should she tell him to stop? I mean, she's quit. What's going to happen to this motor now? But she can't bring herself to say that, right? Because that would be her decision under her signature under the decision that there is no purpose to live for anymore. And she can't accept that that's true. Looking out at the forest, she thinks, no, that's not true. And we'll come more to that. But that is a part of her decision. She's given up the railroad. She hasn't given up the motor, at least the reconstruction of the motor. But
Greg,
she
I was
should
not
if she's
spoiling.
Ben,
the reference I just made was to a previous chapter. It was the chapter where they shut down the John Galt line. Conversation they have after that.
It isn't that part in conversation. Okay, so part of her reflection on this is in the cabin is on her particular purpose, right? What should I do with my life, and how can I live without the world, and what could I do instead of it? But we also get a lot of general reflection on the role of purpose in life. So let's talk a little bit about that, and then try to tie that into her particular questions about formulating her own purpose. Anyone want to start us off on this? Any thoughts on this? Yeah, Carrie Ann?
I liked her distinction between straight lines and circles.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess there's a lot that could be dug into in terms of what makes a difference between the two, because the circles are an important part of sustaining yourself through life. So how much is encompassed within the circle? Because those are activities that take time, like making food and the various things that maintain homeostasis that keeps you in being. And there are a number of things that fall in that, but you need something longer range. Although I suppose the longer range planning of food production and trade, et cetera, will help you do the circle bits too, but the circles have to be part of a lifelong trajectory.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting for those of us, and that includes both you and me, who are interested in Greek philosophy, that Rand has this idea, or Daphne has this idea anyway, of, inanimate matter, there's nothing but circles. But a straight line is the mark of reason, the mark of a living being, particularly a human life. And for the Greeks, right, nature goes in straight lines, earth goes down, fire goes up, but souls make things go in circles. So there is a kind of interesting opposition there. And I think that points to something that's distinctive about Rand from the, even the parts of the ancient Greek tradition that she has the most in common with, this idea of a life has to have a direction. It has to be building on each other. And so if you look at the distinction she draws is between the meal and the path. I think, Ben, you'd highlighted some of the passages on this that were distinctive at some point. But when you're building a meal, it's just over and it's done with, and then you need to make the next meal. And there are all these kind of chores that you need to do, and then you just need to do it all over again. It's like a Sisyphus kind of situation. As opposed to the path, each more thing you do on the path grows longer. And there's that beautiful line about how these things sum up. Each day achieving its immortality. I forget the exact line.
The work of cooking a meal was like a closed circle, completed and gone, leading nowhere, but the work of building a path was a living sum, so that no day was left to die behind her, but each day contained all those that preceded it. Each day acquired its immortality on every succeeding tomorrow. I mean, one of the things that I like about this is that you see, I mean, it's so completely opposite of the kind of looter mentality that is embodied in that 10 to 89 directive, whereas they wanted to freeze everything, she wants to have constant motion. And whereas they had, narrowed their focus down to the immediate moment, she thinks that human life doesn't even exist unless it's taking the future into account and the past, and it's all integrated. There's a line from one of her writings on aesthetics where she and a lot of people quote her for many reasons on this, but it's those who fight for the future live in it today. And I think that was a view that was a line of hers that's more than just kind of a rallying cry for activism. It actually contains a good amount of her view of what the essence of human life is, that it's not just like an animal that lives in the moment and reacts to stimuli, but has a view of cause and effect and past, present, and future, and a self that is seen as contained in a narrative across time. And I mean, that's what Daphne wants, but she doesn't have a way of getting it in the world that's made everybody else live like an animal.
A world that's geared to the needs of people who are trying to live as though they were animals. I don't think they're actually living as though they're animals, because animals are able to live that way. But the people in this world are not getting on very well trying to live this way. But this is, the idea of, Betsy tells us that Prometheus means forethought, and that's right. And Prometheus is we're told that John Galt is Prometheus who changed his mind by Francisco, so that myth comes up in Atlas Shrugged. It's also a myth that Rand references a number of other people. He's the god who brought fire down to man and who brought man reason, arguably, depending on how you interpret things. The life of an animal is in cycles, so the idea goes. The cycle of breeding its young or getting food. Everything an animal does, I think Daphne thinks and Rand thinks in some of her nonfiction writing, is analogous to the making of a meal. It's something that, it goes through this cycle and then it ends the cycle. It's like a program that has a loop in it. So its life, insofar as it continues, is like a string of circles, a string of zeros leading off, right? Whereas what a human being's able to do is create a purpose that's kind of cumulative, that builds on itself in the way that a path does. And you can see that was how Daphne was thinking at the beginning of the novel about her life, right? Her goal was to make, was this railroad, but the railroad was like a living thing. It was in bad shape now, but she was going to save it by building this Rio Norte line. Having built the Rio Norte line, she was going to then have a really profitable branch of the railroad. That would be enough to redeem the system. She would build an ocean-to-ocean line of Reardon metal, and then she would move on to the next thing and the next thing. She hasn't been thinking that way for some time, though. Right? I mean, basically since the Colorado Destroying Directive, she hasn't been functioning that way. And now 10-289, I think, brought that all the way. She's not able to do anything like that anymore. And she gives up on the railroad entirely, or at least tries to, and sets herself the goal of doing it.
So, Greg, one question you could ask here is if it's so important to always be moving and looking to the future, why isn't that enough? Why do we also need something like a single central purpose to tie it all together? I mean, you could just say, well, yeah, I'm going to keep doing different things, and I'll do a different thing tomorrow and a different thing after that. Amber asked a question about this broader issue of the role of purpose. She says, Francisco tells Daphne the most evil person in the world is the man without a purpose. Can you elaborate on the author's interpretation and evaluation of human purpose? What does it require? How and why is it so important?
Yeah, well, I mean, we're going to see more, I think, about the author's view of purpose later in the novel, where there's going to be some more theoretical points made about it. So I'd rather not try to say that much abstractly about it right now, but I think we can see a lot about it that's being said here, right? So a living thing is something that's acting purposefully. Life has some kind of directionality to it. For a human being, it has a long-range directionality for it rather than just little ranges in cycles. This is being portrayed as a tremendous psychological need of at least some human beings, people like Daphne. The people who don't seem to have or feel this need are, well, they're not portrayed sympathetically in the novel, and maybe that's because there are certain people who don't have this need and the author thinks ill of them, or maybe the idea is that they've stifled or given up on or have so failed to fulfill this need that they've become a disreputable sort of person. We'll have to think about that more as we start to get more insight into what's driving these people. But for Daphne, at least, it's a tremendous spiritual need. And we've seen that the people who have this kind of need and act on it and function this way are the people who are creating and producing the bounty on which the world depends. They're the people who are leading the code of life. And so I think what we can see at this point is a kind of contrast. There are these purpose-driven characters who are always looking to go further, to build on it, to come up with the next new thing, to see how it fits together, to integrate their lives into a wider and wider sum. Think about Reardon with the various signs representing the different businesses, but also the different parts of his life and how he's building more and more out, and he'd like to be able to light a sign over that was the Reardon life sign, right? Rather than just Reardon coal or Reardon oil or not oil, but Reardon this, limestone and metal. So there's that. And what's the contrast to that? Well, we have characters like the shopkeeper in Woodstock, like maybe Mr. Moen might be another character like this. Certainly the people in Starnesville are other characters like this who are just kind of listless, purposeless. They're just doing their thing. Their life isn't trying to add up to anything. They're not going after anything in particular. They're just trying to live in a kind of stasis. And then we have characters like Jim and maybe some of the other Lillian who do seem like they're driven by some kind of a purpose. They have some kind of an agenda that's, in some sense, they're after something progressively over the course of the novel, but it's portrayed as essentially different than the kind of thing that Reardon and Daphne are after, and it seems to be powered, at least in part, by some kind of resentment for the people like Reardon and Daphne, and we'll have to see what's going on with that as we learn these characters' insides more, and I think we will as we go forward. I mean, one thing, Amber, that you mentioned was that we have Daphne setting herself 3 concrete goals to accomplish, the ones we talked about earlier. Got to learn to live without the railroad, get the pain out of the way and rest, right? Amber also notes that Reardon set himself two concrete things to accomplish in the last chapter, and she points out in The Fountainhead, Gail Wynand also does the same thing. And one thing that's interesting about that is in all three of these situations, we're talking about characters who are very purposeful people, characters who are very driven in this way we've talked about, and who have a central goal that they've organized their lives around, and who have now lost that goal, or lost something central to it, and are trying to learn to live without and cope with that. So I think what we're getting in these three cases is an illustration of what a kind of super purposeful person is like when they've lost their purpose, and they're trying to purposefully deal with that fact about themselves. Okay, so in Daphne's case, why can't she set a purpose? She needs a purpose. She knows she needs a purpose. She's given up on the railroad. Why can't she set a new one? Well, I think we've already said quite a bit about this. First, all her attempts bring her back to the railroad. Now, you might think all her attempts bring her back to the railroad just because she's fixated on railroads. And she is fixated on railroads, but even every time she wants to draw a metaphor, it ends up being a railroad metaphor because her whole mind is organized around railroads. But it's not just that she's personally fixated on railroads. There's something in the logic, even apart from railroads in particular, about what she wants to do that leads her back to railroads. And Alex, I'm just going to quote something you said online, that I think brings us out. Alex wrote, "The railroad represents the arteries of all commerce." And Daphne's mind immediately jumps to commerce as the culmination of the productive efforts of her mind. If Daphne had a purpose, like she wanted to write symphonies that she wouldn't let anyone hear or something, maybe she wouldn't face this kind of problem. But it's not just, whether she would ultimately or not is something we can think about. But she's not facing it so immediately in every case, only because she's hung up on always thinking about railroads. The other kinds of things she might try to do, reclaim an apple orchard, help the people build a road, any kind of thing that's productive, that's commerce driven, that has to do with, like, producing the kind of values that help to sustain human life, is in some sense going to require trading with the rest of the world. And so it's going to bring you back to the railroad. The railroad is the kind of central artery of commerce. And even if it's not going to bring her back to the railroad specifically, because she could use, airplanes or roads to do it, it's going to bring her back to the world of 10-289. And then quoting Alex again, she's unable to let go of the railroad. She tries to do so by evading the fact that the bureaucrats have created a world where trade and productivity are no longer possible. Putting aside the issue of whether she's evading it or not for a moment, the fact is that there's a world where this kind of productivity is no longer possible. And so long as there's that kind of world, she can't just pick some other, I'll go into farming or something. It's any industry she goes into, she's going to have this problem. And this brings us to, again, the shopkeeper, right? The shopkeeper is now the limit on her ambition. She can't do anything larger scale than just what she could accomplish on her, acre of whatever much land she has in this forest. Anything that involves production, trade with anyone else, that she can't do. So the other issue here that several people, well, sorry, Ben, do you have any thoughts on this or on connected issues? Take us somewhere in them. Ben, I'm not hearing you.
Nothing that I didn't mention before. I mean, I think that the significance of the shopkeeper again brings up the question of, and Alex's point does too, of if they really have created a world where trade and productivity are no longer possible, it's starting to look like it's a world of shopkeepers. And so what's she to do then?
So this brings us to Pooja and Greg P. both point out that she's in some... Can you not hear me? You should be able to hear me now.
Change cameras. I can hear you. You've got the camera
Thank
on.
you. You
There
just couldn't see me. Yeah. Okay. So Pooja and Greg P. both point out that she's dealing with a contradiction. And a way to put the contradiction There's just this quote. I mean, she could not set herself another goal or summon the love to achieve it, while her rightful achievement had been lost, not to some superior power, but to a loathsome evil that conquered by means of impotence. And she just doesn't understand why her rightful achievement has come to the end it does. And this is something we saw with her before. She doesn't understand why the John Galt line ended up as it did, why it had to. Francisco was asking, don't you see how it had to end this way? And she doesn't, right? She doesn't think it had to end this way. She doesn't see why it should have ended this way. And if it's going to end this way, then any achievement's going to end this way. And she doesn't know how to stop that, how to understand that, or how to find another one. Any other goal she projects is likely to reach this same end. Yeah.
One thing I would say here, it's interesting to compare this passage that Pooja is referencing to which I think Carrie Ann referenced earlier in the evening, back to the scene with Reardon in part 1, chapter 3. It's a much smaller scale version of the same thing, but Reardon's also facing a smaller scale kind of paralysis about dealing with his family and dealing with his wife at the party. And he also reflects, as I've emphasized several times, about how he doesn't understand what's going on, given that he thinks it's right for him to deal with his family, and yet he just doesn't want to. And if normally when he is convinced that something is right, he's motivated to do it. And here she is reflecting on the fact that she would be able to stop wanting to do it if she were able to convince herself that this wasn't right, but she can't convince herself of that.
Yeah, and that seems right. And why can't she convince herself? I mean, we can see she can't see any specific way forward and any other productive purpose in this world. And so what would it be to convince herself in that context that she was wrong to pursue the railroad, or that the railroad was, bound to end up like it did? It would be to accept some premise like, what can you do? Values are unachievable. You can't have the world you want. Things are just going to suck, and you've got to find a way to cope with it. And it would be to accept that kind of a worldview. And you could see her thinking that on this morning of May 28th, right? Should she say, don't build the motor anymore, give up, Quentin Daniels, I've given up, you should too? That would be her signature under the decision that there was no terminal to reach. It's just, you just got to accept that it's a world in which achievements are impossible, that there's no place in the future for a superlative achievement of man's mind. But as she's looking out at nature, at the world, at Woodstock, where she built the path in which she was able to devise these pulleys and see the light through the leaves and so forth, she can't believe that. She doesn't think that's right. No, human beings can succeed in the world. It's not that kind of a world. And yet, it looks like it is that kind of a world. And that's the issue she can't deal with. Yeah, or can't carry on.
I want to actually build on Alex's earlier suggestion that there's something that Daphne might be evading here. I'm not exactly sure if it's precisely an evasion. It's at least a refusal to accept. Mm-hmm. And she thinks the only thing that could stop her in her tracks is what she calls a superior power. Mm-hmm. So she refuses to believe that she could be stopped in her tracks by the shopkeeper. Mm-hmm. She calls it the loathsome evil that's impotent. So something that's totally stagnant and that fog kind of person. Mm-hmm. How can that stop her? And that's precisely what she is unable to grasp.
And it's what she's been fighting her whole life. Yeah. But to say she's evading it would be to say she's pushing it out of mind. She's facing it, and she doesn't have an answer, because it's not like she's saying, damn it, I just won't accept that something weak and puny can defeat things that are powerful and thoughtful. You have every reason to think they couldn't. This shopkeeper is a loser. I mean, she can't even keep her damn vegetables not wilting. How is it that I can do all this stuff and somehow she can beat me? It doesn't make sense. And you can see this in when she's talking to Francisco, and Francisco is making this point there. How these men of your board of directors, they couldn't beat Nat Taggart at anything. And yet, how come every time, every concrete battle, Nat Taggart wins, and yet somehow the board of directors ends up getting all the proceeds from his winning? How can that be? That's not a kind of thing that can happen. And so it's not like, you might think that she's not willing to accept that it can happen, but she has every reason to think this isn't possible. This can't happen. And yet it seems to be happening. And she's in a situation that's unintelligible to her. And it's in this situation that, this situation where she can't find a purpose for herself because of this, that Francisco shows up. And they're going to discuss it. So, I mean, first of all, just at a concrete level, what happens when Francisco arrives and what do we learn? There's a lot of concrete action here and concrete revelations, even before we get to the deeper kind of philosophy that Francisco has to impart. So just, anyone want to recap? Yeah, Robert, start off.
Well, he's whistling a happy tune, he kisses her right away, she responds to him, so he is ecstatic.
So what happy tune is he whistling, first of all? It's made pretty clear.
The fifth concerto.
Halley's Fifth Concerto. When she finally realizes what it was, he says, oh, I'll tell you that later. So now we know that there is a real answer to Halley's Fifth Concerto. I think we had reason to think that to begin with. And Francisco's going to fill her in. He has a lot to tell her, he says, right? He kisses her right away. She responds to the kiss. Then she pulls back and says no, kind of recapturing the context. But when she sees him, it's like what she expected their adulthood to be like if things had gone the way she was so sure of their going then. She pulls back because she realizes what? That she's gotten ahead of herself, that she's with Reardon now, that she doesn't understand the situation. Not clear exactly, but she says no. And but he can tell that she's responding to him. And so this, is very heartening to Francisco. I think we learn, Daphne learns in this scene for sure that Francisco has loved her all along. What she's already kind of suspected, that he's viewed her as like the Senora d'Ancona who Sebastian d'Ancona had to wait 15 years for. We learn that night 12 years ago, which was their last night together, was the night that he quit, that he gave up on d'Ancona Copper, that he's done it deliberately, that he's been purposeful for this whole time, not the decadent playboy. The decadent playboy was an act to enable him to destroy d'Ancona Copper, and that this was for some purpose that he thought he could maybe reclaim her at the end of, and so her seeming like saying she could never accept him as the playboy, and seeming to respond to him physically, is something that you could see why he'd be so happy about. And yet he's keeping on, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. That'll be the last thing I'll tell you when I have so much to make up to you first, and so forth. So there's a lot going on then. Any other concrete revelations? Let's see. I don't know that I have any written down that I want.
He was one of the men who quit.
Yes, he was one of the men who quit.
One of the first.
We'll finally know exactly what he's been doing for 12 years.
Mm-hmm, which is
While he was carefully cultivating the playboy image.
Is trying to destroy d'Ancona Copper, and we see her reflecting back and putting all the pieces together in light of that. The boy who cried for help on her breast, how he was the next morning, him purposefully playing with the marbles on the floor when she saw him crying, my love, I can't, and her not understanding why, and everything else. And what's her take on this? How does she feel about him doing this? Yeah, Ella?
She has a hard time accepting it and accepting that was the moral proper thing to do in this case.
Mm-hmm.
She sees what he did as kind of giving up and wasting his talent when he had the potential to become greater than Sebastian d'Ancona, but he threw this away and planned the destruction of his company. She can't fathom why that is.
Yeah. Now, she doesn't see it as just a kind of losery passive throwing away, because she says what she feels is a combination of admiration and horror. She's now tried to give up the railroad, and she sees how hard it is to do, and he's done it and been purposeful about it. So there's a real admiration for what he's done, but also a horror about it. And her perspective on her quitting is what? Well, she sees it as a giving up, as a betrayal, as... What's her word for what she and Francisco have both done in different ways? Renunciation. I'm not sure I can take it now, because Francisco asked, could you have taken it 12 years ago if I had told you back then, right? And she said, I'm not sure I can take it now, either my kind of renunciation or yours. So what she sees them as having done is renounced what they lived for, given it up. And we can see this when Francisco's so happy at the beginning of the scene. Harry M. points out that Daphne says, are you happy that I've lost everything I've lived for? Now, that's not, of course, how Francisco sees it, but she sees it as she's lost everything I've lived for. Are you happy? Fine, I'll say it. You were the first thing I lost, right? And now I've lost all the rest. Is that what you wanted? And that amuses you somehow? She realizes that it's not amusement, that he has a serious reason for this, but even if she still holds it as, I've lost everything. And he asks her, right, well, do you think you betrayed Taggart Transcontinental? And she says, no, I would have betrayed it by keeping on working under these terms, and yet it's still a kind of betrayal to have quit. And that's, again, this contradiction that she sees herself in. It's betrayal if I leave, betrayal if I stay. It's renunciation if I leave, renunciation if I stay. And why renunciation? Why is renunciation the concept that's so salient to her here?
She's giving up the railroad and she's letting it fall apart. During her time in Woodstock, her mind keeps going to all the problems, all the technical things that she needs to fix to keep the railroad up and running. And she's kind of consumed by this worry of what would happen to the railroad if she weren't there.
Renunciation, I think, is a little bit stronger than that. It's a very significant giving up of something, like you radically changed your mind about its value. And I think that's
giving up
what
something
he's
you
failing
love.
to grasp, that he actually is more committed to it, and she's not yet seeing that his actions reflect that. So the part that she's missing is what's blocking her ability to see the contradiction and to know which premises to give up.
Yeah, or anyway, the part where she disagrees with him, because I mean, if you're trying to get to, New Jersey from here, and you're going to take the Holland Tunnel, but it looks like it's too busy, so then you decide you're going to take the Lincoln Tunnel. That's not renunciation of your Holland Tunnel plans. And maybe it would be closer to renunciation if you decided, well, you're not going to go to New Jersey after all. But it would be really renunciation if you decided, travel is not worthwhile, I'll just be a hermit, or, whatever the deepest values that led to that.
It looks like you need to recrop my picture, but I was going to say that what makes renunciation distinctive, I was going to say in response to Carrie Ann, is it's giving up something you love. And I missed a little of what you were saying because I got cut off, but this is something that comes up a lot in this chapter. And Harry in the chat says, he points us to a question that Daphne asks of Francisco. How could you make yourself do it? How could you make yourself give up the company in this way? And importantly, this is page 617 of the standard edition, he says, by the grace of the same love as yours, my love for Danconia copper, for the spirit of which it was the shape, was and someday will be again. And both David and Pooja in the earlier discussion noticed that the exchange between Francisco and Daphne here is very similar to the exchange that you see earlier in the book when Daphne's meeting with Ken Daniger. She's asking Daniger a lot of the same questions. How can you give it all up? Don't you love it? Here's with Francisco, it means as much to me now as it did that night. Then how can you let it go to pieces? And they basically have the same conversation, she and Daniger. How can you let it up? And he says, if I told you that I meant more to me now than it ever did before, would you believe me? And there's probably a reason that there are these parallels. Do you see what I mean about the screen being cut differently? Maybe you can't fix that now because
I can't fix it, and I think it has to do with something about your camera rather than something that's my framing. But it has zoomed out.
I'll fix it when I'm off camera if I can.
Okay. Anyway, there is a real parallel here between these conversations. And of course, now we know Francisco is one of these men like Daniger who quit. So there's something in common there. But he's well, that's Robert, you're trying to take us ahead one chapter. Yeah, but anyway, he's one of these men like Danaher and Wyatt who quit. So it's interesting to see that there are commonalities with Danaher's point of view.
That ties into something she says earlier. She says she stopped thinking that there was a destroyer because why didn't he come for me?
Yeah.
But she knows somebody came to Danaher.
Right.
And when she asked who was he, Danaher said, if you know that much, you know I'm not going to tell you.
Yeah, so she has evidence that there is a destroyer. Anyway, someone who's coming to see people.
Well,
part of
also,
why she gave up on the destroyer theory. Oh yeah, go ahead, Ben.
when she says nobody came, Francisco says no. And I'll just leave it at that. I mean, he's asking a question in a kind of Francisco way,
Just like
which is
nobody
that.
came for Reardon that night before his trial.
Yeah, when Francisco turned up. And Francisco says, if I had thought you'd be ready to quit, I would have been watching you like a hawk day and night. This is my one failure. So you get the sense that Francisco is a guy who comes. But why does Daphne think there isn't a destroyer anymore? Because she thinks there's no way, it's impossible that someone like her would give up on the railroad. And it's impossible that someone like Ken Danaher would give up on Danaher Coal. And yet, now Ken Danaher has. So there must have been some like magic guy who said some inconceivable thing to convince him to do it. But now here she's given up on the railroad without anyone coming to tell her some inconceivable thing. And so she doesn't think she needs a destroyer to explain the phenomenon of quitting anymore. Although she has independent evidence that there actually is some guy who's telling people things. But I think, the way she must think is, yeah, some guy came to see Ken Danaher. But he's not the problem. I used to think there was this guy who came and told people something, and he made them quit. And there's no way they'd quit without it. But really, all right, there might be some guy who tells people stuff sometimes. But, I quit without it. What made Ken Danaher quit wasn't some guy. It was what made me quit. But I don't understand how they can go on and live without it. And what Danaher and Francisco both have is the sense in which we haven't given up the thing we were living for, right? I haven't given up Dankonia Copper. Even though I'm destroying it, I haven't given up. I'm doing it by loyalty to my love of that thing, to my love of Dankonia Copper, to the spirit of which it was the body, was and will be again. So there are two things that we see that are different in Francisco from Daphne. And on Francisco's side, we have Danaher, and I also think Ragnar, you can see he's on the same side. Now, Ragnar wasn't a guy who ran a business and quit, but still, Francisco says, was that spirit of which Dankonia Copper was the soul, was and will be again. So he has the hope and expectation of some future. That there's some positive goal, and we see that with Ragnar too, right? I haven't given up on the future. On that day when you'll be able to make a profit from Reardon Metal, do you see that? Do you think you're going to see that day? Asks Reardon. Don't you, Mr. Reardon? Asks Ragnar. If not, then what are you working for? What are you doing? So Ragnar and Francisco have some future in view that they're fighting for or working for. Some future where these problems that are besetting the characters in the world won't be there, whereas Daphne and Reardon don't have any hope for such a future. So that's one difference. We can see that here. But the other is that they think that, and we see this in Danaher and especially in Francisco, that by the love of somehow their love of their businesses is motivating them to take this surprising action for somebody who loves their business, which is abandoning it in some way. And how can that be? Well, it's not renunciation of the love, but it's loyalty in it in a different or unusual form. And the way Francisco puts it is, we can never give up the things we live by, never really, but we might have to change their form somehow if we've made an error. So there's this suggestion that there's some error Daphne's making, and And we have to see what it is. So what else does Francisco say along these lines that indicates what error he thinks she's making or how it works? Yeah, carry on.
There's also a dispute over what they each think they're guilty for. If they could be defeated by something inferior, then aren't they responsible for letting things come to be the way they are? And they have an argument over what the nature and object of their guilt is.
Yeah, so Daphne thinks somehow this has to be our fault. Why does she think it has to be our fault? Well, because the enemy is this wimpy thing. It couldn't defeat us, not if we were doing things right. And she has reason to think that. And Francisco thinks that that's true. It's our fault. But in what way is it our fault, thinks Francisco? Because Daphne doesn't have another view of how it's our fault. Her default view has been, well, we didn't hold out long enough. But she's held out as long as she could, and it's just gotten worse and worse. So she's no longer at the point where she's sure the thing to do is hold out and keep running the railroad. But she doesn't have any other alternative for what their mistake could have been other than giving up too soon. Yeah, Alex.
So the point which Francisco is trying to make to Daphne is that the fault lies in the fact that she's been paying a ransom for her virtues.
Mm-hmm.
It was the theme that Francisco expressed before in with the Mills when he was speaking with Reardons. He said, "You've been paying blackmail not for your vices but for your virtues." And the same thing is true in Daphne's case, where she was the one that enabled the leaders to leech off of her and off of her productive ability, and to condemn her for the very things that were enabling them to survive.
Yeah, I mean, the way he puts it is that what we were guilty of, all of us, Nat Taggart, Sebastian D'Anconia, you and me, you Daphne and me, Francisco, is we fought them, and Nat Taggart fought them with every weapon but one, their moral code, right? Their moral code was their weapon. And Daphne's response, which Reardon can't make, was, well, we never accepted their moral code, right? Because Daphne always emphatically rejected it, knew profit-making was good. And this is where we get the idea of, yeah, but you might have never accepted it, but you accommodated it, right? You paid ransoms for it. And Ben, did you want to say something?
Well, I just think it's interesting that just like before we were talking about what makes renunciation different from any old giving something up, what makes ransom different from paying any old price is that it's paying a price for the sake of releasing a hostage you love. And yeah, indeed, Francisco described it this way. Daphne, theirs is the morality of kidnappers. They use your love of virtue as a hostage. This is page 619 of the Standard Edition. And one of the things that we were trying to get people to see in the earlier online discussion, we asked a question about how many of the issues in this exchange come up earlier in the book. And people noticed a number of things, but one thing they didn't notice was where this same idea comes up in Reardon's thinking right before he signs the gift certificate. And he puts it in almost exactly these terms, that they're holding us by our love, just like they hold all the different slaves in the slave states of Europe by their love of their life. Incidentally, Daphne puts it in these terms at the very end of this chapter when she explains why she does at the end of the chapter what she's going to do. And all throughout this scene, we find that this is an issue of love for Daphne. I mean, when she's dealing with this grieving process of having left Taggart Transcontinental, she's putting it in terms of having left a loved one. I mean, she thinks of the railroad as the body of a loved one, and missing it. And so, I mean, I think there's more that we could say about this, but I want to hear what others have to say.
Ben, you raised a very good question earlier when we were talking about this, about, in fact, what's wrong with paying ransoms?
Yeah, well, I mean, Daphne could say, I think, somewhat reasonably at this point. I mean, you have your loved one held for ransom by a kidnapper. If the code that Francisco wants us to be following here is the code of life, why wouldn't you pay ransom to get that person out of the grip of the kidnapper, especially if their life is in danger, especially if they're irreplaceable to you? And that's the way that she sees Taggart Transcontinental. She sees it as like a living person. Though this connects to the other big issue then that we wanted to discuss, Greg, of
Yes.
Whether it is and under what circumstance.
Yeah, how is this different from a situation in which a loved one is kidnapped and you're considering paying a ransom? I mean, is Francisco saying you should never do that? You should never pay the ransom to the kidnapper under any circumstance? Carrie Ann?
No, well, kidnapping is such a strange aberration. What they're dealing with is a whole system that's now become a matter of course. It's the way of living. It's the norm now. It's not a one-off where you're going to correct it very quickly and punish the evildoer.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, so if you have a loved one that's kidnapped, maybe you pay the ransom, maybe you just send the cop after them, maybe you pay the ransom and then try to send the cop after them. But it's a self-contained emergency where a value of yours is under threat, and then it will not be under threat once you've paid the ransom, hopefully, once you've gotten the person back, and then you'll be able to go on leading your normal life. But now we're living in a world, it's much more like blackmail than like kidnapping. When you pay blackmail, you have to keep paying the blackmail, right? Because they still retain that threat over you the whole time. Interesting why Reardon thought he'd be able to get away. He'd not be in that situation. But anyway, he didn't.
Or as Kipling has it, you pay anyone Dane Guild, you'll never be rid of the Dane.
I don't remember that line, but that's a good line. And it's a situation where you're never going to be out of this situation of paying off the extortion, paying off the blackmail, paying the ransom, in which case your life will be a series of these cycles of getting out of one catastrophe after another. It's a kind of system that prevents you from projecting a long-scale purpose, from leading a life of your own, because it's keeping you hostage to these constant demands of the blackmailer, of the kidnapper. And then there's the other side of it, which is the loved one really the living thing that Daphne thinks it is? And what does Francisco have to say about that? Yeah, Alex.
Well, a human body is different from something like Taggart Transcontinental, because once a man is physically injured or killed, he can be no more. Meanwhile, the point that Francisco tries to make to Daphne is that we can afford to give up these material things because our minds are what enable them to exist in the first place.
This is a point that we saw before. And this is one of the things I was wondering if anybody online would catch. I don't think anyone brought it up when we asked in what previous scenes have we seen things like what's going on in the conversation between Francisco and Daphne. But Francisco says, yeah, we're the thing that makes something like Taggart Transcontinental alive. It's alive. Well, where have we seen an idea like this before? There's one really significant place where this idea about machinery or companies being alive in their relation to certain people came up. And it wasn't Francisco saying it in the other case.
It was Daphne on the John Galt line.
Yeah, it was Daphne on the John Galt line. So what was the realization there? She's thinking the machines, the motors, frozen form of intelligence. She's thinking they're like a living thing. And then she says, no, they are alive. But their soul operates them by remote control, right? Their soul is in the body of every man who had the idea to grasp the connection, to understand how they work, to run them. So they are alive, but the soul that operates them isn't in them, but it's in the human beings. And if those human beings should vanish, then they go back to being streaks of rust, and the oil would go back to being some primordial ooze, right? So now, what Daphne's focused on is the soul of these things. These things are alive, but their soul is in the productive people, the people like her and Reardon and Ellis Wyatt, and now Francisco, it turns out, really is one of those kinds of people. Their soul is in those kinds of people. And what Daphne's focused on is that for them to remain alive, those people have to be there, to use their souls to operate them by remote control. Francisco brings back this analogy that we're the soul of these things, right? But he adds another dimension to it. If we're the soul of which these things are the body, we're the soul that gives them life, then they only go on being alive. They only count as alive insofar as they're working to support us. So if you think of the relationship between your soul, and don't think of soul in any mystical sense, maybe it could live on without you, but just in the sense of whatever it is about you that makes you alive, whatever it is that animates you, whether it's some metabolic process or something that's centrally coded in it, whatever it is, the life force, the thing that makes you count as alive, right? Think about, well, what the relation between your soul and your hand is. Well, the point that Daphne's focusing on is that the soul is what makes the hand go and work. And if the hand didn't have a soul, it would just, be dead and not there anymore. But Francisco adds another point. There's another connection between the hand and the soul, which is that the hand does what it does to serve the life. And if it didn't do that, it wouldn't be part of that life anymore. It wouldn't be a living thing anymore. Like if you imagine the hand got some kind of cancer or some infection where it was acting against your body. We are the soul of which railroads, copper mines, steel mills, and oil wells are the body. And they are living entities that beat day and night like our hearts in the sacred function of supporting human life, but only so long as they remain our body, only so long as they remain the expression, the reward, and the property of achievement. Without us, they are corpses, and their sole product is poison, not wealth or food, the poison of disintegration that turns men into hordes of scavengers. So one thing Francisco's saying here is, if we leave them, they're not going to do the looters any good. They're going to turn back into the primeval ooze and so forth, as Daphne thought, and even they're going to be dangerous to these people. But also, insofar as we're not able to live by them now, insofar as we're not able now to use them to support our lives, they're no longer really living things, even if we're trying to animate them, even if we're trying to keep them on life support. Somebody said online that Daphne comes back to do CPR to the railroad, and that's a nice image. Or maybe think of the railroad as her being a respirator that's keeping the railroad alive. But if the railroad's not able to serve its function, and we'll have to think more going forward about what that function is for human life and for her life, then it's being on a respirator isn't it really being alive? It's like Terry Schiavo, something that's being kept alive, but it's not there anymore. And that's Francisco's view about it. The railroad isn't there anymore. The railroad isn't there to be of value anymore. Go ahead, Ben. Yeah.
I think it's interesting that even though Dagny grasped a form of this point early on in the novel, she's not seeing it as clearly now. Now there's a point on which both she and Reardon have seen this more clearly, and that's with regard to like the pleasures of life, recreational things. I mean, Dagny's thought about this all along with regard to the lights and the flowers of the party, both when she was at her debutante ball and when she's at Reardon's party. And then later on, after early in part two, Reardon's taking her out to the restaurant and talking about the luxuries and saying we're able to appreciate these material goods in a way that everybody else isn't, even though and that's because we add meaning to it. We know how to enjoy them. But neither of them quite sees this in relation to the central purpose of their life with regard to industry, which I think is really interesting. And I'm not sure why it's a blind spot on their part.
Well, they see the fact that these peripheral values only have value insofar as they can make use of them to celebrate their lives. But I guess what they're not seeing, or Well, the point that Francisco has that they don't agree with or don't see, don't understand, or maybe he's wrong, right? But is that the same thing is true about the central values of their lives. Their values only to them, but it's not only. I think Daphne would say it's a value to me, but not to the looters, right? So she says at the end of the chapter to Reardon, they don't care if there's a single wheel left spinning or a blast furnace in the world. So I think Daphne realizes that these things are only of value to her, and they're not of value to the looters. But what is the issue? I guess she thinks it can still be of value to her, even if it's not able to function in a way that serves her life. Because she thinks, what do I care if I'm paying ransoms or giving things up? I get to keep the railroad alive, and the railroad is valuable to me no matter what. It's all I want out of life. And she's not grasping that it's only, or for what Francisco would say, is it's only valuable even to you under certain conditions. And you're not seeing that those conditions aren't met, that it's not what you think it is.
And it's not a model railroad that she's just playing with. It's there for people to actually be transported on, and you need to have more than just model people to do that. I was also going to say, Greg, that I think it's interesting to relate this back to Francisco's money speech and to some of the points that he initially makes there, because if so he asks, what is the root of money? It is production. And what's the root of production? It's the mind, and you need to have freedom for the mind, for money to be possible. Now, one level on which to read this is just, well, people need to have brains to make stuff, which you can then exchange goods and services for. And that's certainly true and important. It means a lot to somebody like Reardon when he hears it for the first time. But what Francisco is saying here is going, I think, one step deeper. He's not just saying that you need to have a mind in order to make the good. He's saying there need to be minds for the goods to be of value to anyone. And that if you had the exact same physical object, but all the people in the world died, like that oil that you mentioned just turned back into ooze, it wouldn't be good or bad for anything or anyone. And even if you do have people in the world, but they are in effect like the shopkeeper or worse, living just like animals in cycles that don't involve conceptualizing things as good or bad, but just taking things for granted, just living like an animal, they're not going to be good in the human sense. One thing that I was thinking of earlier also is it's important to... Go ahead.
And even if you have people like Daphne or Reardon to whom they are good, because those people are seeing them as a value and are understanding how they can use them, they're not good for Daphne or Reardon if Daphne or Reardon are unable to integrate them into a life that benefits them.
Right.
So think about Francisco saying to Reardon, well, have you made any money off of the Reardon medal? I mean, granted, it's a really good medal, but you had this goal that you were going to create it and offer it in exchange to other values for people, and people like Ellis Wyatt were going to ride on your whales, and they were going to give you something great in exchange for it, and so forth. And how did that work out for you? It didn't, right? And now we're getting the same issue he's saying with Daphne. So it's even Daphne's being able to understand and value this thing objectively is not enough to make it really a value to her. She also has to be able to find a way to make it serve her life. And now she can't because of the political situation.
And I think this also has important implications for the central message of that earlier speech, which was about money. Something that was paradoxical about the chapter in which that appears is he gives this big speech on why making money is such a great sign of virtue. And then what happens at the end of the chapter? He loses a fortune, because he precipitates a stock market crash and makes a lot of other people lose money too. And it's a mystery at that point as to how or why that would be happening in the same scene. But now I think we're starting to get a better idea of it, because the value of money itself is conditioned by some of the issues that we've just been talking. Just like physical goods don't have value in a world that is bereft of mind, the same is going to be true of the currency that you happen to hold in your pocket in a similar kind of world. And I mean, what he's in effect doing is he's asking Daphne to stop making money in this world, in the form that it is circulated.
Or
And
celebrating
what
the
else?
fact that she has stopped, right? And
Right.
she's taking the fact that she has stopped as her giving up, her finally being beaten. And now what's she going to do? And he's saying, no, this is good. You're beyond their reach. And now let me tell you about all the things you have to understand. He has a lot more to tell her, right? All the things you have to understand so that you can be like me and the other people who have quit, and see how we haven't given up on the world, and somehow there's a happy ending to this. But before he could get through with that, like maybe before he could get through with some similar speech he seems to have been trying to give Reardon at one point, news of a catastrophe comes. And she runs out like he ran at the sound of the siren for the furnace break. And he tries to stop her, but he can't. And this brings us to the remaining scene of the chapter, right? We cut to Jim and Eddie. We see how Jim's taking the catastrophe, and then we have Daphne's return. And I want to say a little bit about how Daphne's acting on her return and get your views on it. We don't have too much time. We can take a little longer than the 90 minutes that we normally would because we had some technical difficulties. But I don't want to take too much longer. Ben, I know you had some thoughts on Jim. So do you want to just give us a kind of synopsis of what you think are the high points or low points, as it might be, of Jim's dealing with this, and then we'll come back to New York to talk about Daphne on the return?
I'll try to make this really brief. A lot of the rest of the chapter has been about love and how both Daphne and Francisco are motivated by it, though to do different things, and how the morality of hostage takers is to hold people by their love. We get an interesting contrast by way of Jim's focus on his hatred. So we have love versus hate, and we also get an interesting psychological portrayal of the conditions that are associated in his mind with hatred, because we've spent a lot of time so far in this project talking about Francisco's line that the only evil thought is the choice not to think. And we've talked about evasion and ways in which various negative characters do that. And you see Jim doing it in spades at the beginning of this scene. I mean, this evasion is strong with this one. He doesn't, he wants to quit, but he doesn't want to put it in writing and say that he's going to quit. He has reasons for needing to return to the office, but he doesn't want to. He spent his whole effort to not know those reasons. There's something in particular that's forming in his mind that he doesn't want to quite name, but it has something to do with Washington, certain threats that are being made. And then this kind of ball of emotion finally takes form, and we see what its object is. And was it obvious to everybody what the object of his hatred was? I'm curious, because it's not stated explicitly, but you can infer it, I think, from the circumstances. I don't know if you all can still hear me.
We can hear, but do you want to just say because we should try to go through this?
Well, the very first thing that he does interesting, he's motivated. Up until this point, he's also been paralyzed by all these different kinds of fear that he's, the object of which he's trying to evade. But suddenly the hatred finally gets him motivated, and he rushes out of his office and immediately demands Eddie to tell him, where is she? And he's, of course, talking about Daphne. And I think that she's the object of his hatred. And that has implications when you think about this threat that's taking form in his mind, that he's guiltily pleased by, this threat of nationalization. Because if he can't be president, well, then nobody can be president. And there are all these things, all these facts that he doesn't want to name, and that's being expressed as hatred. And I think we're going to see more moving forward about the connection between this kind of psychological evasion and the emotion of hatred. And there's a reason that they're connected, and it'll be good to track that connection.
And so he's now with Eddie, demanding that Eddie tell him where Daphne is. Eddie's standing firm. I'll never let you know, and you'll never find her. Interesting to think of why Eddie is so adamant on this and so loyal to her, and why he's the only one who's calm in the face of all this. But let's let that be something to discuss on Facebook if people want to discuss it. Then Daphne shows up. Now, Harry points out that Daphne's like a sleepwalker going through the motions. I take it that the significance of her moving like a somnambulist with a somnambulist's assurance is that she didn't know what to do. She was torn. Should I stay or should I go? Should I have quit or should I not? I shouldn't have quit, but I also shouldn't go back. There's no right answer to what you should do. And then in this crisis, she acts on her automatized responses, on what her kind of deep down gut instinct is. And in a crisis, she acts. And she acts to save the thing she loves. And so she comes back with the somnambulist's assurance. And it's really concrete now. The railroad falling apart, and the tunnel's been destroyed, an achievement not to be equaled in our lifetime, and the continents, it's just horrifying. And she runs back to fix it. But how are things different? How is she different after she's come back? We had some comments about this on Facebook in connection to also how Reardon is different after he's given in by signing the gift certificate. What stands out about how Daphne's different from how she was before? Any thoughts? I think there are some really striking differences. Yeah, Carrie Ann?
Well, she's described as not seeing people. She looks at things as though they're merely physical objects, and the one word that really leapt out to me was she looked ruthless. Mm-hmm. She has a goal. She's going to save the railroad. Nobody's getting into her way. She's going to set terms for Weatherby, or she thinks she's setting terms for Weatherby, and she's going to break any law, bribe anybody, and she doesn't actually really seem to be feeling any love for the work that she claims to love.
All right, so there's a lot there, right? Yeah. One, she's not seeing other people. Mm-hmm. She doesn't see Jim at all. Jim has the sense that he's invisible, and then suddenly she looks like, oh, she's noticed someone, but it's Eddie walking in. Mm-hmm. So people are invisible to her now. All the people around her are invisible. Where did we see that before? Not in Daphne, but... Yeah, go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, Reardon on his walk home before Ragnar, that whole description of that. Yeah, he doesn't see people anymore.
After Reardon gave in, as Reardon puts it, right? He says to Daphne on the phone, I've given in to them, I've signed their gift certificates. He says, who am I to blame you? Haven't I when I came back? And it's when she comes back that she's not seeing these people as people anymore. They're like objects.
Greg.
Even Eddie. Yeah, go ahead, Ben.
I was just wondering, it's interesting, you might read this reaction of hers as just a kind of stereotypical sign of being in shock. But is it possible that it's also bearing the marks of the conversation that she's had with Francisco, where Francisco has tried to convince her that without her, the world is a corpse, and these people are without souls, and now she's back in this world, being made to be their slave in effect. And is it a surprise that she sees them, that she can't see them, that she doesn't recognize them?
Good question. Well, there's another aspect of it which Carrie Ann noted that's connected to this not seeing people that does suggest something more like shock than having been convinced by Francisco that these aren't fully people or something. Although I think it's probably somewhere in between those, or some more complicated cocktail of them. And that's that she doesn't seem to be, she seems to be totally disconnected from her own feelings. And we even see that in like her manner communicates to Eddie, I would feel sympathy for your feeling if we could still feel any more, but of course we can't. She's described as being like a business machine. That's nothing new, that's new. Eddie thinks of her as like totally calm and not having any emotion, but then she violently sweeps all these kind of propaganda socialistic papers off her desk and goes on talking calmly while she's doing it, like there was no connection between her mind and her body. Francisco, now here's, I think, a real connection to Francisco. Francisco's just been telling her, right, there's this issue, you're kind of, there's something going wrong with her thinking, thinks Francisco, about the spirit-body issue. Now maybe this way of having her spirit being disconnected from her body is something she's doing on purpose because of what she learned from Francisco, or maybe it's a new perspective she has because of what she learned from Francisco, or maybe everything's just come to a head and now some point that Francisco was making is more obvious, or maybe it's meant to be obvious to the reader, But in any case, there's some real issue about her mind and her body not being connected in the normal way that they would be. There's also, yeah, Robert.
One great thing she does here, she tells Mouch exactly what he should have heard, which I really like. That was something that shows she's in some sort of focus about the past and the present, linking the two there.
Good, so she tells off Wesley Mouch. She doesn't make terms with him, although, I mean,
She'll start breaking laws.
Yeah, and that's the other thing Carrie Ann said, and Reardon says, I'm about to, I better start bribing everyone. So now both of them
Pooja
are like,
noticed this.
yeah, good, and Pooja pointed this out online, that they're both now just, willing to break the law, willing to fully embrace the role of outlaw in this system. And Daphne's doing it much more explicitly than before, right? She's telling Eddie what lies to tell, how to fit people up with the system, and she's saying, charge me personally. So what Daphne's doing now is fully owning the role of a person who's paying ransom, right? She's saying, they're holding us by our love of it. They're ransoming us. We love the railroad. We love industry. They don't. Me, Daphne, and you, Reardon, love industry, love the railroad, love these things. You don't. They don't care if it happened. We care. And they're making us pay ransoms for it. And we're going to do it because we love these things. They're holding us by our love of it. But what do we care what the cost? Cost no object. We're trying to save the thing we love. Except she's got no hope of saving it, right? We're going to go down with the last wheel and the last syllogism. Yeah, Ben.
And that's exactly the thing that she said she wouldn't do earlier in the chapter where they dismantle the John Galt line. She says, I'll let the last train run over me. And she says, and Francisco says, you wouldn't really do that, would you? And she says, no, it's just self-pity. So why is she permitting herself this kind of self-pity in spite of her best convictions otherwise?
What's the option? I mean, what she said was she wouldn't let the last train roll over her. But, I mean, what she's doing is dedicating herself to a lost cause, right? She's going to go down fighting for what she loves. But what's the alternative? Give up and purposely destroy Taco Transcontinental like Francisco's doing? What's that? Or just let it go to hell? What's that going to accomplish?
Well, this maybe raises the issue that I don't think mentioned earlier. One of the final things that Francisco has to say when she finds herself connected, when she finds herself facing these dilemmas, contradictions don't exist, and when you think they do, check your premises. So, what premise does she need to check?
Francisco has the view that there is some way forward.
Yeah.
Ragnar has that view. I don't know that we're in a position to see what it is. Daphne certainly doesn't see that there's any way forward. And so this is her position. But I think we can see she has gotten from Francisco this idea, this clarification of what her role is. She's somebody who's being held hostage by her love. She loves life. She loves production. She loves the railroad. She loves these things. And other people are extorting her based on that love. And she's willing to pay the ransoms and go along with it to try to keep those things alive a little bit longer, to try to eke out a little bit more of a human existence, to not let... I mean, we should keep clear what she thinks is happening here. She has seen Starnesville. She has seen people reduced to a pre-industrial, back-breaking, subhuman form of existence in a town that had been prosperous. And we're talking about the whole world sinking into that. There'd be no life after that. There'd be nothing to live for. There were no values. We're talking about the end of civilization. And her view is, well, I have to do everything I can till the last minute to keep the ship afloat. And if I have to go down with the ship, I'll go down with the ship. But there's no life in Starnesville to lead. I can't let the world go the way of Starnesville. What could I do then if I was in Starnesville? There'd be nothing. There'd be no path ahead. The motor gone to rust. Human achievement totally forsaken. Society gone. What's left then? for
Greg, this reminds
Go
me
ahead, Dan.
of an anecdote that I've heard secondhand about Ayn Rand, and maybe you've heard the same thing too. But there was a friend of hers in the 40s. I have thoughts as to who it might be, who was believed in a kind of survivalism, and Ayn Rand had the view, from what I've heard secondhand, that you can't. I mean, she lived in the city. She lived in New York. She loved New York. Her friend was afraid to live in the city because of what might happen if civilization were to collapse. And from what I've heard, Ayn Rand's view is that, if it comes to that, what's the point? So hold out in New York.
Well, even not just that. Harry Binswanger, who was a friend of hers later in her life and a friend of mine, at both of ours,
I think he's the one I heard the story from, by the way.
told, I think, a separate story, though, or maybe it was a related one. There was some period later when people were thinking of leaving New York, and maybe even he moved to LA for a while. There was some worry about what would happen if there was a war. I don't remember exactly what the issue was. And her view was, I'll go down with New York, right, if that has to happen. And I think that's Daphne's view. I mean, could you imagine letting all of the world descend into Starnesville? You're someone who loves industry, who's enraptured by this idea of a motor that can transform the world into a greater industrial place, and you're willing to let the world become Starnesville. I mean, what future could there be after that? Maybe even to purposely, fully push it towards Starnesville. That would be renunciation. That would be what passes through her head. What
This
the
is
hell
why
is
I couldn't
Francisco
keep
thinking?
watching The Walking Dead.
What is Francisco thinking? What is he going for? How is there a future if Starnesville's the end of this road? Stay tuned for other exciting editions of the Atlas Project, and more importantly, for other exciting and inspiring chapters of Atlas Shrugged. Good night, all.
Thank you.
Good night, everyone.